Hey everyone, so I was out for a run today and I was tracking a new route and I thought it'd be pretty cool and maybe kind of interesting if we could build an application to store GPS routes. So something like Strava or Runkeeper or one of these applications. And I don't think it would be that difficult and it might be kind of fun to play with some mapping libraries and some GPS data. So yeah, let's build it. So in order for this to work for you, you're going to want to collect some data in the form of a GPX file, and I'll post a link below with a description of exactly what that data is. Alright, so I'm out here on a little walk and I'm going to go ahead and log my GPS, and then when I get back, we'll load it into our application. Alright, I'm back and I have created the application that we'll be building together in this tutorial. So again, the idea here is that this is a run journal. It could be a walking journal or a hiking journal or what have you. Just a place for us to log any sort of GPS activity that you might want to collect. So on the front page we have a table, and then in this table we have a row for each activity that we've recorded. And so that activity is going to have a name, some comments, the date that that route was logged, as well as the total distance covered on the route. Then at the top of the page we have some aggregate counts that get calculated from this data set, so we can see the total distance covered, for instance, the total number of entries in the set, as well as the earliest date. So if I click on any one of the entries here, you can see we get taken over to a nice detail page where we'll have a draggable map here. It's provided by the leaflet library, and on the map you can see that we have a layer that is actually going to show us the route that we took as we collected our GPX data. The tiles are provided by a company called Mapbox, who provides a free API for us to use, and you'll see that they have some different themes that you can implement to give your map a particular look or feel depending on your application. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so you need a few things installed, so I'll just go ahead and cover those very quickly. You'll want to install Node, which is going to be your JavaScript runtime. It's also going to provide you with NPM, which is a JavaScript package manager. Then you'll want to make sure that TypeScript is installed. You can install that from the command line just by using npm install-g TypeScript, and so you'll obviously want to do that after you set up Node, which will come with this NPM package manager. And then in this particular project, once again, we'll be using the Angular CLI, which is going to speed up development by scaffolding out our application and also creating some templates for our different components and services that we'll create in this application. So if you have any more questions about those, feel free to check previous videos, and I go into a little bit more detail about how to get set up with these tools. Alright, so I'm going to just create a directory to store our project. So we'll call it Run Journal, and then we'll cd into that directory, and we'll use the Angular CLI tool to scaffold out a new project for us. So just ng new, and again we'll say Run Journal. And so the CLI will just take a few minutes here and generate all of the files that we need for a bare bones Angular 4 project, and it's going to pull down a lot of Node packages for us and store those in a Node modules directory. So once that's complete, I'll restart the video. I'll be using Atom again in this video to edit code. And so you can see on the left side of the screen here, I've loaded the Run Journal project directory that we created. And you can see the different directories and files that the CLI has generated. And so if we just take a look inside the source directory at our index.html file, we can see the boilerplate HTML template that was created with our app root tag here in the body. So let's head back to the command line, and we'll just make sure that the application is working by typing ngserve. And this is the command to the CLI to create, first we want to cd into our run journal, and then type ngserve. And this command will tell the CLI to fire up its development server. It will open at port 4200, and then it's going to listen anytime we make changes to our code so that we can view those very quickly in the browser. Okay, so all of our TypeScript and everything compiled correctly, so we should be able to open the browser now and see the bare bones application. So I'll just open up an instance of Chrome, and we'll head over to localhost 4200, and we see the familiar AppWorks message provided by the application that the CLI generated. So everything should be working properly. So let's head back into the code now, and I'll stop the server for the time being, and we'll open the app directory here. And now let's think for a minute about the structure of our application. So if we're thinking kind of big picture, I think we have basically two components that we should be thinking about. We've got the list of activities that we want to log, for one, which has a table in it, and then it's got like a row, if you recall, for each activity that we wanted to log. And then we have a sort of detail component whose primary feature is a map. So we'll call that a map component. So I think we should create two components, one with our list of activities and one for our map. Now in previous videos I showed how to go about creating those components manually, but for this video I'll show you how to use the CLI to generate them for us. So let's head back to the command line, and the command to do so is just ng generate component. The first one we'll create is activity list, and you'll see that it's created our CSS, HTML, and TypeScript files for us. We won't be covering testing in this particular video, but you'll notice it also creates a spec file for us. And it's also updated our app.module.ts, which is kind of a nice feature. And so we'll just very quickly generate our second component, which we'll just call map. Okay, so let's go back to the code and take a look. So now you'll see in our app directory, we have two new directories here. We have activity list and map, and those contains the files that the CLI generated. So let's look at our activity list component.typescript file first. So you can see the boilerplate component code that the CLI generated. So we're going to import component and onInit from Angular, and then we have our component decorator with a selector app activity list, a template URL that points to the template inside this activity list directory, as well as a style URLs array that points to a style sheet also inside of this directory. And we're going to export the activity list component class, which implements onInit, which just means that we have to implement this ng onInit function inside of our class here. Okay, so let's think a little bit about this activity list component. At its core, all it really is doing is providing us with a list of this activity object to display on a page to the user. So at minimum, I think we need a property that's going to be used to store the array of activities that we log. So we'll call that activities, and we're going to type that as an interface, and we'll call it iActivity array. So this could be a class. Yeah, you could really do that however you like, but in this case we'll create an interface, and so we're going to need to import that, and we're going to store that inside of a shared directory. It's going to be just one directory up from this component in a shared folder, and we're going to call it our activity.model. Okay, so let's just create that directory here in our app folder. And then inside of it, we'll create our activity.model.ts file. And so this is going to be a very simple file. It's just going to export our interface, iActivity. Again, this could be a class if you like. In this case, it really doesn't matter too much. All right, and then so now we have to think about what is an activity that we want to log. In other words, what sort of properties does an activity have that might be of interest to either us as a programmer or to the user? So I think first of all, each activity should have some unique ID, which we'll just use a number for this. And then probably a name, which could be a string, and then a date. So this would be like the date that the activity was logged, and we can actually type that as a date. And then we'll put on, say, like comments, and we'll actually make this an optional property with a question mark here. that will also be a string. And maybe the total distance of the route, which we'll make optional as well. That could be a number. And then finally, we need to create a property here that will be used to store our GPX data that is associated with each activity that we log. And we can just type that as a string. Depending on how you wanted to organize your application, this could also be an object that you create a specific class for. There's a lot of different ways we could work with this. So you could think about the different ways that you might want to handle associating GPX data with your activity object. In this case, we're going to use a string, and that's just going to be used to point to a particular GPX file on disk. So GPX is actually an XML format, and so there are a lot of different ways you could handle parsing it or turning it into a JSON object. You could turn it into GeoJSON, which is actually what one of the libraries we'll be using is going to be doing behind the scenes. But it's simple enough for us in this case to have this GPX data property on our activity just be a string that points to a location where we can store that .gpx file on disk. Okay, great. Now the next thing I'd like to do is, well, first of all, save our files here. The next thing that I'd like to do is to add a file that's going to contain a list of activities for us to sort of work with as we're developing the application. So inside our shared folder, I'm going to create another file, and we're just going to call this activities.ts. This could be another TypeScript file, and this one is simply going to import our iActivity interface from in the same directory here, and we call it activity.model.typescript, and it's going to export a constant saved activities array, which of course is of type iActivity array. Okay, and so this just means that every element inside of our array here should implement the properties that we define on our iActivity type. And so what you want to do is you want to create an array of objects here which have all of the properties that we define. So like an ID of 1, a name, a date, and the way that you're going to define a date property here is by saying new date, and then in parens a string that is some valid date format. So distance, which we could calculate in the future for our sort of dummy data here. For now, we're just going to put in a number, and comments, and then our GPX data, which is going to point to, again, a GPX file on disk somewhere. So we'll store that with our project. So 2 directories up from here, inside of our assets directory, we'll create a new one called GPX, and then in here we'll have a set of GPX files. So for instance, 1.gpx, you're just going to want to name that whatever the name of the file is that you're going to drop in this location. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and create that directory. So inside assets here, create a new folder, and we call it GPX. And then I'm just going to drop some GPX files that I have and place them inside of our directory here. Okay, so now I'm also going to paste in a few more activities here that I've already typed out. All right, great. Let's also take a look now very briefly at a GPX file. So if I open one up here, you can see that it is valid XML, and there's actually a lot of data here. In addition to our latitude and longitude, we also have values for elevation as well as the time that this activity was logged. So you can see that this particular activity was logged from an old run that I had actually 5 years ago now, so quite a long time ago. But yeah, we've got a lot of data here. So you can imagine how you might use this besides just plotting it out on a map. You might use one of the many JavaScript charting libraries to chart elevation over time, or say like your running rate over time. Many of the things that you see in activity tracking applications are using a format similar to something like GPX, where you have more than just the coordinates that you've walked, but you have this time dimension as well as often the elevation. So we can do that by injecting that service here. So we'll call it a private activity service, and it will be of type activity service, which we'll need to create. And we'll also need to import it here into this file. So inside of our app directory, once again, could create a new folder and we'll call it services. And then I'm going to use the CLI just to show you that we can use the CLI to generate all parts of an Angular application, components, services, pipes, modules, etc. And so yeah, we can just use that to use the same command here. Instead of ng generate component, we'll ng generate service, and we'll call it activity. So you can see very quickly that the service has been created. So the CLI has created a service.typescript file as well as a spec file once again, and then it's given us a warning that it's not been added to our list of providers. So we'll make sure that gets done. So we can see it in our app directory, and so we just need to drop each of these files here up into our services directory, and that's just going to be how we'll structure this particular project. Now we'll head over into our app.module.ts file, and we'll take care of that warning. So inside of our providers array here, we're going to add our activity service, and we'll need to import that as well. So I'll just import that here underneath of map component, activity.service. All right. And so once again, let's head back to our activity list component.typescript file, and we're going to use the service, as I said, to handle some of the logic that's concerned with our activities. So for instance, let's say we wanted to grab the total activities, which will just be a number, and maybe we want to collect the total distance of all of a set of activities, which will also be a number. And then let's say we wanted to get the earliest date in the set of dates that are on each of these objects. That would be just the date. Okay, so we've got some properties here, and we have injected an activity service instance into our constructor. So let's think about some of the methods that are going to be on our activity service that are going to return each of these properties. So for that, we'll tuck them into our ng-on-init method. And once this component is initialized, we'll set values for each of these. So once an instance of this class is initialized, we will assign values to each of these properties. So we'll do something like this dot activities is going to be on this private activity service that we've created. We'll have a method that's just called get activities. You could call it get all or something like that, as long as it's clear what this method is doing on the activity service. And we'll create another method, so we'll say this dot total activities is equal to this dot activity service dot get total activities, and for that we'll probably pass the array that came back here. So we'll pass this dot activities, and we'll write similar methods for total distance and first date. So you can see that this first method is going to be used to return all of the activity objects in our collection, and then these bottom three methods here are going to use that collection and then get some useful information from it. So before we get much further ahead of ourselves here, let's go into our activity service and write out some of these methods. And I just noticed that I dragged the wrong files over into my services directory. This activities TypeScript file is what contains our array of activities. That belongs in shared, and our activity model also belongs in shared, and then our services obviously go in the services directory. So now that that's cleared up, let's look at our activity.service.ts file, and again we have some minimal boilerplate code for an Angular service here. We are importing injectable from Angular, and we're using that decorator here, which just means we're going to be able to inject an instance of this service into any one of our components, as we've done, and it's going to provide us with this activity service class. So if we look at this in two panes here, I think it'll be easier to see. And actually I'm going to bring this pane down to the bottom here. So we need to write these 4 methods that we have implemented in our activity list component. So first, let's import that list of objects that we had created. And now we'll import from our shared directory. Okay, and so let's write this method first, our getActivities method. And we'll type this as returning an activity array. And so very simply, we really should just return a copy of that array. And we'll do that by returning saved activities. And a simple way to do this is just to call .slice and pass 0, which is in other words going to start from the 0 index on this array and give us everything afterwards. So in a sense, we just return a copy of this. And now I'll write a method for getTotalActivities, which takes in as a parameter this.activities, which is going to be the result of getActivities. And so that will look something like this. And again, we'll pass in all activities, which has to be a type activity array. And once again, very simply, this is just going to return the length of that array. This is, of course, sort of a trivial example, but I do want to show you how it's nice and clean to sort of store all of the handling of the particular objects that you're dealing with inside of a service here. So we're just returning a copy of that array that's being handled by the service, and we're getting its length, for instance. We don't necessarily need to write methods for that and wrap very simple functions, but I think it's good practice to start thinking this way. And so these next two are a little bit more interesting. So if we want to get the total distance, so this is different from actually calculating the distance from the GPX data that we have. This is going to aggregate all of the distance properties that are on each object in our collection. Get total distance. And so there are a number of different ways we could do this. We don't have to get too clever with it. We can actually just use a pretty simple for loop here. So let's create a variable called total distance, which will initially set to 0. And then I'm just going to create a loop that is the size of our array. And so for each element in this array, I'm going to add the value of distance at each particular index. Okay, so you can see that we create a variable total distance, set it to 0, and then for every index in this array, we're going to grab the distance at that index and continue to add that value to our total distance variable here. And then once that's complete, we're just going to return it. All right, and finally, let's write our getFirstDate. So getFirstDate, I could probably make some type of software developer joke about writing a method called getFirstDate, but anyway, and we'll pass in all activities again. And our structure for getting the earliest date in a set of objects here is going to be structurally kind of similar to the way that we got the total distance from the set of objects in our array, in the sense that we're going to create a variable called earliest date, set it equal to some new date, like way in the future, and then we'll create another loop here, and then inside of this loop we will store a variable called current date, and we'll set that equal to the date at this particular index. And then we'll just have some logic here to check whether or not that date is earlier than earliest date. So in the first go through this loop, any date that we record that is before New Year's Day, year 9999, is going to be set to our earliest date. So we'll set that to our current date. And so once that is complete for every element in our array, we'll just return the earliest date. So this is kind of a sort of like brute force algorithm. We're just going through every element in the array and checking that date occurred before the index that we are iterating upon. So it's simple, and I think it will work well enough for our application. Okay, so I'm going to close this tab and get back to a single pane here. Now let's just do a quick smoke test to see if our code is still compiling and whether or not we have any sort of errors happening. Okay, so we've got a bunch of typos here. Let's just go through them and take care of it. Probably should have kept the server running earlier so we could check on things like this, but anyway, we'll make it through these very quickly. So first of all, when we import things here, we don't need to specify the file extension. In fact, that will throw an error. So I'll get rid of that, and then I'll correct this typo here on export. Okay, so now if we look back at the command line, in activity service.ts on line 30, cannot find name current. So let's go back and take a look there down at line 30, and yeah, I called the variable current date, so we need to fix that, and everything compiled successfully. That's good. Now let's see if we can get some of the data that we have written methods for out onto the page. So we'll go back up into our activity list component, and then let's go into the HTML here. So you can see that the CLI has generated some boilerplate HTML code for us, which is just going to let us know that the activity list component is working. So I'm just going to delete that. And so just for a quick sanity check, let's go ahead and use interpolation to put out some of those numbers that we've calculated onto the page. So first date, and then I'm going to implement a built-in Angular pipe here, the date pipe, to format our date to make it look a little bit more readable, and we'll use one of the built-in arguments that we can pass, in this case long date. If you search for Angular date pipe and take a look at the documentation, you can see some of the built-in arguments that you can pass. It's sort of like if you're familiar with C# when you call string.format on a date to sort of convert it to a more humanized form. So take a look at that if you're interested in outputting the date in a different format. All right, and I just need to go correct some more typos here, which apparently I left in this file. So this should be total activities here, and down here in our ng-on-init method, I made a typo here as well. So now let's check out the page in the browser and see what it looks like. So you can see that we are putting out the total distance, activities, and the first date from our set. And you should double check this, that this corresponds to the values that you put in your activities.ts array here. So if you add up the distances, they should add up to your total distance here, as should the number of total activities and the first date. So let's just do a quick test here. Let's say we add 10 to one of our distances, and we go from 19 to 29. So that appears to be working correctly. All right, cool. So now let's say I wanted to put out a list of activities. So we want to display on the page all of the activities in our array. So we can do that really easily with the ng-for directive. So let's head back into our activity list component.html, and let's say that we have a very simple table. Okay, so we have a table head, and then a row for the table header, and then we'll just have a set of cells here that will be the heading on each column. All right, great. And then in the table body, we'll use an ng-for directive here to create a new row for each element in our saved activities array. So that would be like tr, and then star ng-for equals, and then we just say let activity of activities. And then so for each one of those, we're going to create a row. And so that row has a set of cells. Just gonna go ahead and close the row off before we forget. In each cell, we're going to store the property of that activity that we want to display. So in the first column, we have the name, and we use our date pipe again here. And I'll just display this a little bit differently just to show you another option that we could pass in. So before I passed in, I think like short date. In this case, we'll pass in this manual construction. And then our comments. And actually this one goes above our date. And then here we'll display the distance. All right, cool, so let's check that out. So there you go. Now we have an ultra simple HTML table that has all of our data displayed on the page. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to do is take care of some of the third-party libraries that we will be dependent on for our styling and for creating our maps. So we'll just get all that out of the way now. So I'll head over to the command line. We'll stop the server for the time being. And then we'll go through each of the libraries that we'll need to use here. So the first thing that we'll do is npm install -- save bootstrap. This is going to install Bootstrap, obviously, and this is going to be used for styling our page. Next, I'd like to install Leaflet. And Leaflet is our library for scalable maps. So they're really nice, mobile-friendly maps. You can actually take a look at the Leaflet NPM page for a little bit more information here. Of course, you could also browse their GitHub if you'd like to check out their documentation in a little bit more detail. They've got actually a really fantastic documentation for their API, and this little app can do so much. It is just a really fantastic experience if you need to create maps of any kind on whatever type of application you're building. The next one that we'll install is called Leaflet Omnivore, and this is actually from Mapbox, who is going to be providing our tiles. In other words, they're going to be providing sort of like the look of our map. So they also provide this library called Leaflet Omnivore, which combines a whole bunch of other useful libraries for parsing different types of data. So you can use CSV, GPX, which is what we'll be using, KML, and a few other things. Otherwise, you'd have to implement something like a library like 2GeoJSON yourself to translate between the GPX file that we have, which is XML, and something that Leaflet can consume like GeoJSON. Leaflet Omnivore is going to take care of that for us, so let's go ahead and get that installed. And then finally, we will install a package for Mapbox. Great, so let's go briefly take a look at Mapbox. So Mapbox is an open source mapping platform, and it is going to sort of give us this really nice look and feel to our Leaflet maps. So there are other APIs that you could use, but Mapbox integrates extremely well with Leaflet, and it's got just fantastic documentation once again. It's also free if you're going to use like a reasonable number of maps. Of course, if you were going to use it professionally, you'd have the premium option, but it's totally free just to develop with and play around with like we're going to do here. So I encourage you to check out their documentation if you'd like to learn more about Mapbox. Again, their documentation is just really great. You can do things like geocoding and reverse geocoding and analysis and all types of like satellite imaging and things like that with Mapbox as well. So let's go back to our application, and we're going to head down into our Angular CLI.json file. Now this is a dot file, so again, depending on your operating system, this may be hidden. So you just want to make sure that you can get to it so that you can edit it. We're just going to add some styles and scripts to this using the libraries that we just installed. All right, so we have added styles provided by both the Leaflet library as well as Bootstrap. And then if we head down into scripts here, we need to add scripts from both Leaflet as well as Leaflet Omnivore. Okay, and just clean that up a little bit. Awesome. Now with that, I'm actually going to go back up into our activity list component HTML file, and I'm just going to paste in some HTML here that's going to use our Bootstrap classes. Okay, so I'll just scroll through this, and you're welcome to pause the video and copy it directly. Otherwise, there's a link in the description below to the code on GitHub. And of course, you could also just write your own template here. So notice that the only real difference here is that I've structured the page with some Bootstrap default classes like table and table hover, and then I've added classes that will style ourselves here for some of the other elements. So we'll just go into the style sheet for this component, and again I'll paste the code here. Alright, I'll scroll up. And again, feel free to pause the video here or find the code on GitHub. You'll notice that I am importing some Google fonts. So in order to grab those, we'll head over to fonts.google.com. So we'll search for that here. We can see it below, and basically we just copy and paste the link to the remote CSS here, and we place this in our index.html file. All right. So let's start our server back up and take a look at our page. And if we head back over to our page and reload, we're starting to get something that looks a little bit more reasonable. Great, now let's actually add some of the global styles that are going to give the general feel for the entire application. And so first I'll head down into my styles.css file, which is located in the root of the source directory here. And I'm just once again going to go ahead and paste what I have here. So you can see that I've dropped a background image into our assets directory in the image folder. So if we go here, we need to create a folder called img. And then we need to find some type of background here to place on our page. If you're looking for images with, say, a Creative Commons style license, I'd recommend heading over to Pexels. There are a few other sites like this, like Pixabay, for instance. Pexels has some really nice stock images that you can use. So I think I did something like, just type in run here, and you can use really anything that you like, that you find here. You'll notice that many of the images on here, if not all of them, I'm not exactly sure, have this at least free for personal and commercial use, and many of them don't require any sort of attribution. So they're perfect for small projects like this, or for portfolio work and that sort of thing. So finally, I'm going to head over into our app.component.css file, and I'm going to paste our last style sheet for the page here, right? And I'll scroll up. And now let's go to our index.html, and I'm just going to wrap this app root tag in a div with class layer. All right. Now, if we head up into our app component HTML file, if you recall, currently we just have the heading and our activity list component on the page here. So the way that we'd really like this to work, though, is if we go back to our page here for a minute, and what we want to be able to do is click on any one of these links here and then be taken to another page, if you will, or our other component. So we have to think about how we want to do that. And I think one of the most straightforward ways of doing that with Angular here is to use routes. So let's go back to our app.component.html file here. And first of all, I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. So we'll take the heading tag out, create a container div here. And while we're in here, before we handle routes, let's just go ahead and create our navbar. And we'll put our title inside of our logo here, which is just in a paragraph tag that we styled. And we'll create one more container here. And then instead of having our activity list component here, we just want to put instead a router outlet tag. And so the way this is going to work is that Angular is going to serve up a component based on a particular route that we provided in the URL. Okay, so then in our source directory, let's create a routes.ts file. And this will get us started. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll import routes from Angular router. And we'll import our two components. I know we haven't actually touched our map component yet. We'll do that very shortly, but we'll import it here anyway because that's going to be one of the two views that we have in this application. All right, and we'll import our map component. And now we are going to export a constant value app routes. This is going to be of type routes, which we've imported from Angular Router. And this is going to be an array of route objects. And so we're going to define a path. And for our first one, we'll call it activities. We can call it runs, doesn't really matter. Kind of tired of typing activities. So we'll say runs component, and it's going to be an activity list component. And then we'll create another route, which is going to be found at run, and then the ID that we're going to pass it, and that will give us an instance of the map component in return. So if you recall, on our activity list component, we have a property activities, which is a collection of this activity model that we created and then we implement in the iActivity interface. So if we go look at that, and so the ID for each activity that we have will have a map associated with it. So if we go back to routes, and so yeah, this ID here will correspond to an ID of an activity which will have a map associated with it. So when we hit this route, we're going to be taken to, in a sense, a sort of detail view where we're going to use this map component to show some detail of the activity that we're trying to display. And then lastly, we'll put this redirect. If you use the CLI to scaffold your project as we did in this example, you'll have a base href is equal to / here. You're going to need to define a base href in your application for routing to work. So make sure that you have this tag here if it wasn't generated automatically for you. So now we need to head into our app.module.ts file, and we need to import the router module first. And of course, we also need to import our app routes that we just wrote. And down in our imports array, we need to call, well, we need to include router module, and then we need to call for route app routes on it. So we need to pass app routes to the router module so that it knows what to serve up when we provide it with a particular route. And then actually, if we head back into our routes.ts file, we need to make sure we correct this typo here once again, export constant app routes. Great, so let's look at our page very quickly. All right, and it's already starting to look a lot better. So we've pretty much got the whole front page set up here. Now what I'd like to do is get into the second component, which should go pretty quickly. And we're gonna make it so that when you click on any one of the links here under name, we'll get taken to that map component. But first we need to build the map component, so let's go ahead and get that out of the way. So we'll go back into the code and we'll close some of these folders here for now, and I'll head into our map directory and then into our map component TypeScript file. Okay, I'm going to import after viewing it from Angular Core. And then just like we did for our activity list, we're actually going to create a service for our map component here. So we'll create a map service that's going to handle the logic of drawing our maps. So then I'll want to import our activity type. And then I need to import activated route. Okay, so let's use the CLI and we'll generate this map service now. So I'm just going to stop the server again. And we run ng generate service map. Okay, so we can see that that got created here. So again, we have a TypeScript file and a spec file with TypeScript. So we'll drop each of those into our services folder. And now we'll actually head back into our map component.TypeScript file, and we're going to, just as we did for our activity list, we're going to inject an instance of our map service into our map component here. And we also need to inject our activated route. Okay, cool. So let's think now about this component. So what is this really going to represent? We could do this a couple different ways. You might make this more than one component. In this case, I think it's simple enough to include some of the summary data associated with each of our activities along with the map. So we'll create this property activity, which we'll say can be anything. And now we'll create some properties that will map to the properties that are on our activity. And so anytime an instance of this class is initialized, we want to set it, this activity property here, equal to the activity that corresponds with the activity ID on this route. So if we look back at our routes, so when we go to the URL run/1, then we want to serve up the activity whose ID is 1. Same with if we go to run/2, we want to serve up the activity whose ID is 2. And so the way we do that, inside of our ng-on-init method, we can say this.activity is equal to this, and we're going to use our map service to get the activity where the route here, so we got to access the ID on the route via route.snapshot.params ID is what's passed. So in other words, when we pass the ID of 1 via the route here, we're going to have a function on map service that gets the activity associated with that ID. So with that, let's head into our map service. And what I'm going to do here, import a few more things again. So I'm importing the activity interface we created, as well as the activity service and our array of saved activities. I'm also going to import an environment file that we need to create, and this is what we're going to use to store an API key for Mapbox. So let's go ahead and create that quickly. So inside of our environments directory here, inside of the environment.ts file, what I want to do is create a property, and we'll call it Mapbox API key. And then we need to go actually get an API key from Mapbox and paste it here. So if you head over to Mapbox and then click account here down at the bottom left, and then click on API access tokens, and you'll be able to copy and paste this default public token that Mapbox provides here. And this is what we'll use in our application. So just go ahead and paste that here. And be sure not to share that with anyone or check this environment.ts file into source control. There are other ways that you could store this and keep it secret. You could store it as an environment variable on your particular development machine as well. So now back in our map service, I'm going to create a variable called API token, and we will store our Mapbox API key here. We can access it now through environment.mapbox API key, and now we don't need to keep the API key floating around with this module, but we can just make reference to it from an external file. We're going to declare a variable omnivore, which we'll say is anything, and this will be used by the omnivore library that we have implemented, as well as the variable L here, which we can say will be anything, and this is used by Leaflet. Okay, so then down in our class here, I'm just going to define a method called getActivity, and we'll pass that an ID, which could be a number, and from this we'll return from our saved activities, again, as we did in the activity list component, we're going to create a copy of that array by calling slice at the 0 index, and then we'll write a little lambda here. And now the only other function we want to have in this component is the one that we're going to use to actually draw the map. And we'll call that plot activity. And of course to this we'll also pass an ID. Okay, I'm going to paste the contents of this method, and then I'll talk about what it's doing. Alright, so this is something we could probably refactor, but for now, for the sake of simplicity and for explaining it, I'll keep it as it is. If we go to the top of this method, so it's called plot activity, so the method is going to be concerned with plotting our GPX data on a leaflet map. So the first thing that we'll do here isn't all that important, but it's kind of cool. You can use this to style the route that you are plotting. So you can style like the color and the stroke width and the opacity of that line that's going to show up, that's going to sort of demarcate the route that you've saved. So we're going to store that style in a little object here. And then we need to declare a variable here, map. And this could be, of course, named anything, but Leaflet is going to apply its map method to an object in the DOM with the ID that you pass it here. So we're gonna need to create an object in our component HTML with the ID map. And then when we call setView on that, we're going to supply it with some default GPS coordinates as well as a zoom level. All right, so we'll actually need to declare those up here as well. And then like wherever you like. So that's a number and equal to, again, whatever you like here. Okay, so if we head back down, so Leaflet's used to call map on a div with ID map and set its view to some particular location and zoom level. Then we'll set a max zoom level here on map, on the new map object that we have access to. And then we're going to apply a tile layer, which in other words, this is going to be sort of like the pictures on top of our maps. So Leaflet is providing us with all of the functionality of the map, if you will, and Mapbox is providing us with a layer of tiles that basically sort of skin that map application to show us like the street names, maybe the different colors that the map will have, whether or not it is overlaid with satellite images, that sort of thing. And so we need to pass it the URL to this API here. So that's why we're passing in our access token here. And then we apply some other things to the map here. So we apply some attribution, which is going to show up on the map saying that the data provided by OpenStreetMap. We can again specify another max zoom here or a different max zoom if you like. And then this ID here is going to allow us to choose what set of tiles we'd like to use from Mapbox to apply to our map. So if you head over to mapbox.com/API documentation and then head down to Mapbox classic map IDs, some of them are very basic and clean, like run, bike, hike, for instance, and others are more stylized, so like pirates, for instance. So it can be a lot of fun just going through and choosing a theme that you like that will fit your particular application. And so in this case, let's actually check out some of the satellite images. Okay, and so access token is set to our API token, which is going to look in our environment file for the Mapbox API key that we've saved. And then if you notice, all we have to do to add this layer to our map is to call add to on that layer and pass it the Leaflet map object. So that's simply going to apply our Mapbox tiles, but we haven't yet applied our GPX data, which is what we'd like to do, of course. So the next thing we'll do is we'll first of all apply this custom layer. So this is the syntax for that. So we define this custom layer and it's going to be GeoJSON. So our GPX behind the scenes, thanks to Leaflet Omnivore, is actually going to get converted to this GeoJSON format, and we're going to apply the style that we defined up here in the myStyle variable. And then we're going to apply our GPX layer. So for that, we'll just come down here under our custom layer. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and paste our GPX layer here. Okay, so you'll notice that Omnivore is handling this layer. That's because Leaflet by default accepts only GeoJSON data as input, and so Omnivore is going to, behind the scenes, use another library that converts GPX to GeoJSON so that Leaflet can use it. And so we create a variable to store that layer, and then we use Omnivore and call GPX, and what we pass when we pass this is the GPX data that's associated with the ID corresponding to the activity that we are intending to identify here when we call plot activity. So plot activity gets the ID of an activity, and then we query this array that we have, finding the corresponding activity, and we collect the GPX data property on it, which just points to a GPX file that's on disk. And I'll zoom out just a bit here so that you can see it a little bit more easily. We also pass GPX as its third parameter here, the custom layer that we defined. This is going to apply our styles. Finally, we call .on, and so we say when this layer is ready, we're going to actually fit the bounds of the map around the bounds of this GPX layer. So in a sense, we're kind of just like zooming in and centering our map on this, this layer that we've just added to it. So that's kind of a nice feature. Okay, so I zoomed back in to make my font a little bit more readable. Just because I want this constructor to be at the top of this method, I'm just going to move it up. All right, so yeah, there's kind of a lot going on in this service, but its function is really to simply draw a map, and that map is provided sort of in three parts by Leaflet, which is our actual mapping application, then Mapbox, which in this case is just providing us with some tiles, and Omnivore, which is sort of helping us give Leaflet some GPX data instead of the GeoJSON data that it needs. Okay, with that, let's go into our map component HTML. And I'm just going to get rid of the default that's in here. All right, so I'm going to paste some HTML here. And really most of this is just vanilla sort of bootstrap style HTML. The important thing is that we have a div here with ID of map, which Leaflet is going to need to attach its map object to. It can be named anything, but you just need to specify that when you are calling .map here and passing it an ID. Okay, and then I'm going to use interpolation here to display some of the activity summary that we have on our component. So with the HTML in place, let's go revisit our map.component.ts file. And I'm going to go ahead and fix this small typo here. We're going to implement another function here called ngAfterViewInit, which is another lifecycle hook, and this one's going to get called after the view is initialized. And this is where I want to call plot activity from our map service. And then we'll also assign values to all the other properties on this class. All right, cool. So when the component is initialized, we get the activity. And then after the view is initialized, we are going to draw the map and then assign values to all the properties in this class. Lastly, let's now go into our app.module.ts. And we need to make sure that our map service is in our list of providers. We also need to make sure that we import it. Okay, and I can see I have at least one typo here in our map component. So let's go back and fix that. And yeah, I have an erroneous underscore here. Okay, great. Everything is compiling and it's still looking all right. So what I want to do before we move forward is to complete our style sheets for our map component. All right, so I'll scroll up. All right, now if you think about it, we're still kind of stuck as far as our application is concerned on this activity list page. So there's nowhere to click. There's no user action that we can take to get to our other view. So I could, of course, just manually type it in the URL here, but that's not exactly what we want, of course. So let's go ahead and create links here that are going to be on each of our names, and those are actually going to then take us over to the detail view with a map for each of those runs. So for that, we'll revisit our activity list component.html, and then if we scroll down here to the data cell here where we have our activity name, we're going to surround this interpolated value in an anchor tag, and we're going to bind it to router link. And now let's go take a look at the page. Okay, so we have some sort of error here. Let's inspect. And it says cannot read property ID of undefined. And I confused myself here because I got tired of typing activity. I didn't want that to be in our routes, but this is the activity ID. So this corresponds to the ID that's on our activity object on this page. So slash run and then slash say 1, 2, 3, etc. So we'll go ahead and save that. And now, yeah, you can see that we have links for each of our activities. And if you look down in the address bar at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that the anchor tags are working because we have a different route here corresponding to each of our activity routes. So we'll click on one, and you can see we get taken right over to the map, and you can see our GPX data is loaded on a layer on top of that. So that's pretty cool. We can go to another one here, and we can see another one. With this particular color scheme, you know, you might want to pick a different color besides purple. It kind of blends in a little bit too much here. But let's play around with that just for a minute here to see some of the different tiles that we can apply. So if I head back into the code and we go into our map service, and instead of Mapbox Satellite, maybe we can do, say, like the pencil option, this one. Yeah, so you can see we get a little bit more of a stylized, interesting map here. Say dark. And you can see that we get a nice dark map here. But yeah, play around with it and take a look at the Mapbox documentation for some of the other styles that they have. And very quickly you can see that you can create a really sleek, sort of nice mapping application. So yeah, that about wraps it up for this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We moved rather quickly through a lot of code here, in particular the map service. So if you have any questions or comments about getting that working, let me know. Again, take a look in the description here for some places you can go to get GPX files if you don't have access to a smartphone or another GPS device that can export in that file format. And I'd really appreciate it if you got something out of this video, if you would like and subscribe to my channel. I'm open to hearing about the other types of things you guys would like to build. So I think this will serve as a really good starting point for a GPS activity tracker type application. Some obvious ideas for improvement might be to set up a backend where you can maybe use get and post requests to retrieve and submit new activities. And another idea would be to actually parse the GPX data that you're inputting to actually calculate the distance that the route traverses rather than have that be manually input into each object. So those are some ideas for you guys. I might in a future video show you how you can implement those types of features. If you're interested, please let me know. Otherwise, good luck, and I'll see you next time.